When did you write that?
Oh, it's spring vacation. Why?
When-
Very recently, really.
when-
Mm.
What are your working habits? Do you concentrate for 3 or 4 days on a poem, or 2 or 3 months?
No, I do it very quickly somehow. I mean, I don't eat or bother with anything while I'm working on it, and I generally have somehow thought about it before. It's not as if I mean, I've had a subject, like I had the subject of the idea for this one for a long time without writing on it at all. And when I wrote it pretty much all in a very short space, a day or 2 days, I mean, all the time.
Well, that's Cat in the End Quarters.
With nothing else, doing nothing else, morning, noon, and night. He was howling for supper, and I wouldn't make him any.
When did you write that one?
Spring vacation. It's actually the only time I've had to write for a very long time, and that's one of the reasons why I'm not teaching next year, because I found it really impossible to write while I was working and teaching. And also the kind of analysis I do with my classes is somehow inimical to the sort of work I do by myself. So I feel that actually I do want to spend a year just writing and eating and sleeping when it happens, but writing most of the time,
That's important.
yeah.
What poets do you read for pleasure?
Well, Yeats.
Outside of Ted Hughes.
Ted Hughes continually, and Yeats, Eliot, John Crow Ransom especially. I have started reading Robert Lowell. I like a good deal in Robert Lowell. And then, let's see, Shakespeare, Chaucer, who else? Thomas Wyatt. Who else, Ted, you know? Hopkins, yes, Gerard Manley Hopkins. And let's see, what others? I think Yeats is, I like very, very much, in particular one of my favorites.
But do you feel that your work has been influenced by anyone in particular? Or
I
it
find
sounds
that
to me as
hard
though
to
you think
say. It's so
Sylvia
queer.
is-
Does it remind you of
No,
something?
no, but I wondered if you felt there was any particular...
Well, the strange thing, I think of anything, for instance, I mean, I'd never say that this last poem was influenced by Yeats, but for instance, I learned my first changing in sound, assonance and consonants from Yeats, which, I mean, actually is technical. I was very excited when I discovered this. I also read Dylan Thomas a good deal for the subtleties of sound. I'd never worked with anything except rhyme before, and very rigid rhyme, and so I began developing schemes and patterns of sound that were somehow less obvious, but you get them through your ear, if not through your eye. And I think that I just happened to learn this from Yeats, and Thomas too, in a way.
Well, are you ready to read another poem?
Sure.
You seem to be an extremely scrupulous proselytist. Do you take a great interest in...
Well, how do you mean? How do you mean?
Well, from the standpoint of watching your syllables, your feet, your beat as you go along.
I suppose, well, I suppose, you know.
Does she read? Does she do it? Does she read?
I think so. That comes through very beautifully.
Does it? Because I don't want to stop, and yet somehow I want it to be there, you know, because the lines don't end, they go on, and yet they do end in a way.
You can always tell when she's composing, she's going like that. She doesn't know what she's doing.
Do you hear the music, or do you get the image in starting a poem? Is there some kind of a rhythm that goes...
It's very funny, because I haven't an ear for music, but I hear the music and the rhythm, which somehow I don't think about, you know. It's funny. I have a visual imagination. For instance, my inspiration is paintings and not music when I go to some other art form. What do you think, Ted? I mean, I see these things very clearly, and I have visual images, and yet the sound itself is terrifically strong.
Yes, it is.
Do you know what I mean?
Oh, yes, I can tell. That's the great pleasing quality.
I mean, I feel ideally I'd like to be musical without being artificial, which I think is sometimes difficult, and to be able to speak out, straight out the way you talk, which is again is terrifically hard, while getting all the illusions and richness in that you get in rhetoric, which I mean, it's like eating cake and wanting to have it, I guess.
What is your working philosophy?
My working
As
philosophy?
far as poetry is concerned?
You mean as far as writing poetry goes?
Your own.
About what poetry should be?
Yes.
Well, it's hard to say. My own poetry, technically, as I've said, I'd like it to be extremely musical and lyrical with a singing sound. I don't like poetry that just throws itself away in prose. In other words, I don't like poetry that you could, that is bad prose, and I think a lot of poetry is bad prose. I think there should be a kind of constriction, a kind of tension, which is never artificial and yet keeps in the meaning in a kind of music too. And again, I like the idea of managing to get wit in with seriousness and contrast, ironies, and I like visual images, and I like just good mouthfuls of sound which have meaning. I think that's another thing. I don't like just ramping about in sound, but having a very strong meaning come through the first time. In other words, I'd like people to understand what I'm talking about the first time they read the poem, and to understand it more and more the more they hear it. In other words, to be able to go deeper. But I don't want to baffle anybody. And I suppose that working in my own study, it may be queer to other people. It seems to me very obvious, very ordinary, and I don't know how strange it may sound to ears that aren't accustomed to it. I mean, I have really no idea. I haven't read aloud enough. Very few people have read my poems anyway, so I have no idea how they affect other people. But
You don't consider that it's necessary to write in a strict form in order to get music?
well, at first I started in a strict form. It's the easiest way, I think, for the beginner to get music ready-made. But I think that now I like to work in forms that are strict, and yet this strictness isn't uncomfortable. Sort of like a comfortable corset or something, I suppose. It isn't really noticeable and obvious, but it's there. There's some bone, some skeletal structure to the poem. And I think that for me, at least, I'm very much lyrically inclined, and I lean very strongly toward forms which are, I suppose, quite rigid in comparison certainly to free verse. I'm much happier when I know that all my sounds are echoing in different ways throughout the poem than if I just forget about it.
That's an important thing, I think. It's not necessary to confine yourself to a lyric in order to get a real sweep of music. And you get long lines, and they go along.
Yes,
Just
yeah.
away by the music, and the longer that you go on, the more the music builds up.
Yes, and all the time your ear is recording this, although even your eye mightn't see it. I mean, unless you pick it out and stop to pick it out. But I'm sure poetry should be read. That's another thing. I think that a lot of poetry isn't good when you read it, because it's made for the eye, and it's very ugly to the ear. And I like ugly effects. I mean, one of my favorite sounds is rock, black, and all the words that go against that very hard K sound. And yet, which of course I suppose are ugly if they're all piled up, but they're not to me. But I think that poetry should be able to be read with a good effect to the ear. I suppose I am, very sensuously inclined that way. I like extremely vivid pictures in poetry, not just grey poetry, and I like it very musical, which I guess isn't as fashionable now as it once was.
Well, let's try to make it the fashion that I work on.